Hayford cattle, Shorthorn cattle, Angus cattle, Charolais cattle, Limousin cattle, Piedmont cattle, Johnina cattle, Lincoln red cattle, Hornless red cattle, Gros cattle, Devon cattle, Mary Gray cattle. In addition to these ancient breeds, there were many breeds of cattle that were crossbred with another type of cattle, Zebu cattle and ordinary cattle. For example, Brahmin cattle, Boraford cattle, Barogas cattle, St. Gertrudis cattle, Beef King cattle, Panamera cattle, Bifaro cattle, and so on. The so-called Zebu cattle was a type of cattle that specialized in the tropics. Zebu cattle were found in Africa, the tropics of Asia, and some places in South America. This type of cattle had a huge tumor on the back of their neck which looked very strange. Jiang Hai was very interested in a type of cattle called Beef King cattle. This type of cattle was very popular here. Many people would buy this type of cattle because this type of cattle should be considered a recently cultivated breed of cattle. It had the advantage of being able to tolerate coarse feeding, rarely getting sick and growing fast. At present, there were many large cattle farms in Texas and Montana that specialized in supermarkets, raising this type of cattle. This type of cattle was born from birth to 15 months. Except for the 3-month calf period, this type of cattle could grow 1 ton a year. Moreover, the slaughter rate was quite high. In supermarkets, more than 50% of the commercial-grade beef was from this type of cattle. However, this type of cattle had a fatal flaw, which was that it couldn't grow good meat. Therefore, Jiang Hai just looked at it and gave up. In the last section, they sold varieties that could be used for both purposes. They could be eaten as beef cattle or raised as dairy cows. The main breeds were the dual-purpose shorthorned cattle, Simmental cattle, Swiss brown cattle, Danish red cattle, Angler cattle, Sindhi red cattle, Sahiwa cattle, and so on. However, these had nothing to do with Jiang Hai, and he wasn't going to buy the dual-purpose type. He was mainly eyeing the beef cattle. There were a lot of beef cattle to choose from here. After Jiang Hai came here, he directly chose 20,000 Angus cattle. After booking the place, the cattle business here would naturally send the cattle to him on time. Unless they didn't want to make money. Looking at Robbins Garcia and the others, they knew that these people wouldn't dare to fool Jiang Hai with bad cattle. After choosing the 20,000 Angus cattle, Jiang Hai was ready to look at the other cattle. In fact, Jiang Hai was quite interested in the Siani cattle. However, as soon as Jiang Hai asked about this cattle, he gave up. This cattle was the largest breed of beef cattle and could grow to 1780 kilograms. But first, this cattle was a service breed. In the beginning it was like the Belgian blue cattle. It was good looking but it couldn't produce marbled meat. This was the most important thing, so after Jiang Hai thought about it he gave up the other cattle. Instead he chose a more stable one. He first bought 5,000 shorthorn cattle. This kind of cattle had a creamy fat ratio of 3.9%, which was a little low, but the slaughter rate was very high, 65 to 72%, which was much higher than the average beef cattle. An adult cattle could grow to a ton. In addition to the shorthorn cattle, Jiang Hai also bought some other cattle, such as Charolais cattle and Limousin cattle. He also bought 5,000 of these two types of cattle, a total of 35,000. Plus the 10,000 in the manor, he had a total of 45,000 cattle. Of course, 3,000 of these bulls would be killed this winter. There were also some calves that would grow up and then be killed. Although it was a bit cruel, this was the reality, wasn't it? You bought cattle really fast. You bought it just by looking at it? Looking at Jiang Hai quickly writing a check in front of her, Prawalton couldn't help but ask with some doubts. After all, she was in this line of work, so she had never bought cattle, but she still understood it. According to the experts on her side, buying cattle also needed to look carefully. However, Jiang Hai was not the same as her. Jiang Hai didn't need to look particularly carefully when buying cattle. Because he was very confident in his aura and his ranch, he only looked at the sample cattle. After confirming that there were no major problems, he ordered the cattle. The inspection after the cattle was delivered to his door was naturally much stricter. At least, the cattle with defects could not pass the eyes of the cowboys, so he was quite happy to buy the cattle. Really, I thought you were going to buy cattle for a long time, so I specially asked for a week's leave. Looking at Jiang Hai buying the cattle happily, Prawalton snorted. It's only been 2 days. I can't go back to work now, right? Besides, I haven't had enough fun yet. Looking at her, how could Jiang Hai not understand what she meant? He smiled, hugged her waist, and kissed her on the mouth. Doesn't that mean that you can accompany me when you are not at home for 5 days? Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Prawalton couldn't help but smile. This guy is really getting better at talking. But at this time, Jiang Hai and Prawalton's phones rang almost at the same time. The two had to separate and answer the phone respectively. However, although the people who answered the phone and the people who called were different, The first sentence was the same. Du Feimin's beef cattle are ready to be sold. For this cow, the superior grade weighed 40 kilograms, the special grade weighed 76 kilograms, the preferred grade weighed 145 kilograms, the standard grade weighed 184 kilograms, the commercial grade weighed 122 kilograms, and the usable grade weighed 88 kilograms. The rest were calculated separately. Just the meat alone was $28,000 for premium grade, $19,000 for select grade, $14,500 for select grade, $1,100 for standard grade, $366 for commercial grade, and $88 for usable grade. Although it was far from Jiang Hai's beef cow, this cow was estimated to be $63,000. Looking at the report in front of him, Du Feimin smiled. He was quite happy. He was glad that he had made the choice back then. He had trusted Jiang Hai. Jiang Hai had also given him a huge sum of money. He had raised 1 million cows in total. Apart from the 200,000 cows and calves he hadn't killed, the remaining 800,000 were worth $63,000 each. That was $54 billion. Did anyone know what $54 billion felt like? Although the remaining $400 million was for Jiang Hai to buy grass, Du Feimin had earned $50 million. But he had also earned 50 billion. This was 50 billion. Most importantly, this money could be earned every year. As he thought about this, Du Feimin's heart started beating faster for no reason. His position in Dubai had always been quite awkward. After all, his father had been qualified to inherit the throne in the past, although the current royal family wasn't like it had been a long time ago. Winners were kings, losers were bandits. When a person became an emperor, the people they had to guard against the most were their own brothers. Therefore, the princes who failed to seize the throne didn't have a good ending. As long as they didn't rebel, the current tribal chiefs couldn't kill them. However, they were still far away from the most important areas. For example, his father didn't care about anything now. Du Feimin was in charge of a part of the tourism industry. However, the tourism industry in Dubai hadn't been doing well in recent years. He wasn't doing very well. There were already some people in the imperial family who were aiming for his position. Although it wasn't to the extent of being in a precarious situation, Du Feimin also knew that there were thieves who were aiming for him. This was definitely not good news. However, he was now relieved. With this project that would generate at least $50 billion a year, he would become one of the most important people in this country. Although he wouldn't immediately enter the core of the country, his position in the upper echelons would be as firm as a rock. He immediately called Jiang Hai to express his excitement. At the same time, he told Jiang Hai that he would buy all the grass in his manor in the future. However, Jiang Hai naturally wouldn't do that. Now that the profits from the grass had appeared, Jiang Hai was also considering whether to raise the price. Therefore, his words were a little vague over the phone. However, after Du Feimin heard Jiang Hai's words, he didn't care because the profits from the beef were really too much. Therefore, he could bear to give up some more. Besides, Jiang Hai had also said that he would mainly grow emperor bamboo grass and alfalfa in the future. The price of these two kinds of grass was originally higher than that of ordinary grass, so it was understandable that Jiang Hai would sell them more expensive. Even if the price was doubled, it wouldn't be much. Now that Jiang Hai had provided a year's worth of grass for 1 million cows, the price was about $300 million. It was close to $400 million. Even if $400 million was doubled, it would only be $800 million. $800 million could generate a profit of $5 million. No matter how stupid Du Feimin was, he still understood this. After chatting with Jiang Hai for a while, the two agreed to go to Jiang Hai's manor to discuss in detail when they had time. Then they hung up the phone. Du Feimin, who had hung up the phone, was naturally very happy. Now he would take this report and go to the royal family to slap their faces. He would let those despicable people who coveted him know that he, Master Du Feimin, was back. On the other side, Jiang Hai was working hard at this time. Looking at the people around him who had already fallen asleep, Jiang Hai also smiled at Prawalton, who was dissatisfied with him stopping. The war continued. While Du Feimin was slapping their faces and Jiang Hai was fighting, a storm swept through the whole world's animal husbandry. As mentioned earlier, Du Feimin's subordinates had sent the samples of the grass to many research institutions around the world. Although some of the grass was recovered in the end, they were all from Europe. The Asian countries such as Japan, Korea, Oceania's Australia, and the United States were not recovered. Therefore, there were many people who knew that Jiang Hai had strong grass. Luke Shan, who was in the United States, had already contacted Jiang Hai before this. He had also signed a contract and obtained the first batch of grass. However, Other countries and people were still observing. They also wanted to know the effect of these supergrass. National institutions were far from comparable to each other. Therefore, although Du Feimin's people did not disclose this information this time, it was easy to find out that 100,000 cows were killed. However, it was still easy to find out that 100,000 cows had been killed. They didn't know the details on the report, but they could take in the masters who had killed the cows and make an estimate. Almost overnight, everyone knew that Jiang Hai's supergrass was effective, and the effect was quite good. 4 billion Korean coins. When he thought of this number, he felt the hairs on his body suddenly stand on end. What a joke. Such a person might be able to control himself, but he couldn't. Looking at the way this person bowed, Jiang Hai didn't have the habit of bowing to others, so he just nodded and followed him in. When he walked in, he saw that the representative had already walked out of the room. Although he had a smile on his face, there was a hint of arrogance. This made Jiang Hai feel a little funny. Didn't these guys know that they were here to ask for help? Hello, Mr. Jiang. I've heard of you for a long time. Looking at Jiang Hai, this person walked over and spoke a string of strange Chinese. Fortunately, Jiang Hai could understand. After shaking hands with him, Jiang Hai ignored him and sat directly on the sofa next to him. Oh, Mr. Jiang, I didn't think you would come earlier. Seeing that Jiang Hai ignored him, he didn't care. After sitting opposite Jiang Hai, he slowly picked up the tea set in front of him and poured a cup of tea. Wuxia, Korea, and Japan all liked to drink tea, but the tea ceremony for drinking tea was different. Japan's tea ceremony was inherited from the Tang dynasty of Wuxia. At that time, Japan was very fond of the Tang dynasty culture of Wuxia, so the tea ceremony of the Tang dynasty, including the matcha technique, was passed down to Japan. Korea's tea ceremony originated from the Song dynasty. It was somewhat similar to the tea ceremony of Wuxia. It wasn't so troublesome, but it was just vegetables, hee. Although Jiang Hai was a northeasterner, he wouldn't speak for the northeasterners on this point. There was indeed no good tea in the northeasterners. The good tea was in the Central Plains, and South Korea was about the same latitude as the northeasterners. He didn't have any good tea. Although this guy was fiddling with it, Jiang Hai knew that this thing was very ordinary. However, he didn't expose him. Instead, when he was doing it, Jiang Hai directly placed the contract in front of him. This is the quota that we think is suitable for this gentleman after discussion. You can take a look. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, this person didn't care too much. After pouring a cup of tea, he took a sip and picked up the contract to read. If you don't care about these shares, I think someone else might buy it. Looking at his leisurely manner, this made Jiang Hai a little unhappy. He crossed his legs and looked at this person as he spoke. No, Mr. Jiang, this contract can be said to be very important to me, but it can also be said to be not very important to me. It's important because this contract is an order given to me by the higher-ups, and I must complete it. It's also not important because this is an order given to me by the higher-ups. Do you know anything? I don't raise cattle. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, this person shook his head and said slowly. Chapter 8:19. Hello, Chi-Li, why are you calling me at this time? What's the matter? Looking at the caller, Jiang Hai couldn't help but be a little puzzled, because it was just past 10 o'clock in the morning. He had just walked around the manor and had breakfast. There was a 13-hour time gap between the Eastern American time and the Imperial Capital time, which meant that it was already 11 o'clock in the middle of the night in the Imperial Capital. At this time, Chi-Li would usually be asleep. Since she reached some agreements with Jiang Hai, Chi-Li was relieved a lot. She wouldn't be too busy with her career and ignore her health. Basically, her daily sitting time. Duning also told him that she would wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning and do some exercises, but unlike her sister, she preferred to do yoga. After waking up in the morning and doing some yoga at home for a while, she would go to work at 8 o'clock. Duning was now her assistant and bodyguard. Even if he lived with her but not in the same room. Around 11 o'clock in the morning she would call Jiang Hai. Just when Jiang Hai was at 10 o'clock in the evening, she would video call him. After 10 minutes she would hang up. Then she would go to lunch and Jiang Hai would sleep. After lunch she would work until around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and then take a car home. Since sending Ai Xiaoxi and Feng Yunshin to Jiang Hai, she didn't work overtime. Every day she would get off work at 5 o'clock, and then go to any of the 4 restaurants to inspect them. After dinner she would go home, watch TV for a while or deal with documents and go to bed around 10 o'clock. This was also her daily schedule. And now it's 11 o'clock in the evening. What the hell is this? Why did she call Jiang Hai at this time? Something really happened. I just got the news that our plane was detained. Listening to Jiang Hai's voice, Qili on the other side couldn't help but let out a long sigh, and then said helplessly. Hearing her words, Jiang Hai was stunned. The plane was detained? What does this mean? Just as he was about to ask, he realized that Jing Jin had also called him. Jing Jin also called. Looking at Qili, Jiang Hai said immediately. Let's do a three-way video call. Hearing Jiang Hai's words, Qili also said seriously. This matter is really important. After hearing what she said, Jiang Hai also turned on the three-way call. In an instant, Jing Jin and Qili's faces appeared in front of Jiang Hai. Jiang Hai, bad news. Our plane has been detained by the South Koreans. As soon as the video started, Jing Jin couldn't help but say sternly. At that moment, she realized that not only was Jiang Hai on the other side of the video, but there was also Qili. I just got the news and wanted to tell Jiang Hai about it. It seems that we got the news at about the same time. Looking at Jing Jin, who was a little confused in front of her, Qili smiled and said seriously.